Do-do-da-do, I-do, I-do, I-do-do-do-do-do. So, I bet you're watching this right now thinking to yourself that you're all secure in that seat. But you better be holding on tight. Because we're talking about the only thing that matters, as Dr. Jamie Meltz, PhD, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, said in an opening statement. If we do not get to the bottom of what went wrong with the COVID-19 pandemic, if we fail in our efforts to fearlessly understand all shortcomings and shore up the vulnerabilities this crisis has so clearly exposed, the victims of the next pandemic, our children and grandchildren, will ask us why we failed to protect when we knew what was at stake and had the chance. Dr. Robert Redfield, the former director of the US's CDC, testified how science indicates COVID-19 infections were likely the result of an accidental lab leak in Wuhan, which is in China. His conclusion is based on the biology of the virus itself and unusual actions in and around Wuhan in 2019, including gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The website I am using to get all of this information today is the Committee on Oversight and Accountability, which is a committee that is a government committee that looks over the oversight of our own government. They have a website called oversight.house.gov. I am not only going to be using the American point of view, but I'm also going to be using the Chinese point of view and bring in my own solution, which I believe you will be quite pleased with, and we can all put this behind us for the children. Nicholas Wade is the former science and health editor at the New York Times, which is a highly prestigious American media source, and former editor of Science and Nature, testified how Dr. Fauci and Collins used unverified data to dismiss the lab leak theory in favor of natural transmission. So Nicholas Wade, who is an editor for the New York Times, is claiming that Dr. Fauci and Collins are completely dismissing all of these theories that we have in favor for natural transmission. They're choosing to believe that it was purely natural transmission, but Nicholas Wade from the New York Times believes it's from the Wuhan Chinese. Jamie Metzel testified how China's government destroyed samples, hid records, imprisoned Chinese journalists, prevented Chinese scientists from saying or writing anything on pandemic origins without prior government approval, actively spread misinformation, and prevented an evidence-based investigation. Now, I could argue that America did the exact same thing, which we will get into. So, gain of function is a interesting turn of phrase. I believe I know what gain of function is, but let's look it up just in case. Gain of function is a broad term that covers research that, among other things, involves genetically altering an organism. Yeah, it's what I believed. So what they're getting at is that they were researching under Dr. Fauci a form of... They were researching COVID, basically. They were genetically altering diseases, and this one got out. So they're basically saying that, well, I don't see really any benefit to this at the time, but I can understand why the people that worked on it had a valid reason to do it in the first place, which fair. Science is science, and only until we have real big problems do we stand back and go, hold on a minute, maybe we should do this a little bit safer, like the whole what was it called, the ball of death. What was it? Shit. The Demon Core. That's right. That's right. So this was another example where we took science a little bit too far. This guy basically had these two big plates of highly radioactive material, and when they touched together, it almost killed him like instantly, but it was radiation, so the other people died slowly. It was awful. Basically learned that maybe we should be a little bit more safe than just, touching this shit with our bare hands and sticking some metal rods in here. We got the same thing from the pandemic. It's coming out. Representative Nicole Maliotakis noted that after raising concerns to experts and the World Health Organization that COVID-19 may have originated in a lab in Wuhan, China, and urging Dr. Fauci to investigate the origins of the pandemic, Dr. Redfield was excluded from calls related to the origins of the pandemic. Representative Maliotakis Representative Maliotakis, why did you think you were Representative Maliotakis says, why do you think you were excluded from those calls, Dr. Redfield? It was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view. If you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science. Science has debate, and they squashed any debate. Scientists, including Dr. Fauci, then drafted a paper arguing COVID-19's proximal origins to animals as a wet market. Representative Maliotakis, do you think that this paper does hide the truth? I think it's an inaccurate paper that's basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Representative Maliotakis also warned that the National Institute of Health, NIH, may have been funding gain of research on coronaviruses in the WIV. Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain of function research that created this virus? I think it did. Not only from NIH, but from the State Department, the USAID, and DoD. Representative Miller Meeks, however, has expertise publishing in peer-reviewed scientific journals, asked why the scientific community dangerously suppressed evidence that COVID-19 may have originated from a lab. There is, as you said, Dr. Wetzel, extraordinary circumstantial evidence that this came from a lab. I don't know why the authors didn't want to state this. They did not want to have the scientific conversation and dialogue, why they wanted to obfuscate and suppress the truth, or even have a debate about the origins of COVID-19. Was it for personal financial gain? Was it to hide U.S. financial interests in the Wuhan Institute of Virology directly? Was it to suppress the revelation that there was perhaps a gain of function research that had been prohibited in the United States? Or were they concerned that a conspiracy would develop that it was bioterrorism? Well, I think that last one is what happens when you keep a little bit too much of a secret there, buddy. In September 2019, 3 things happened in that lab. 1, they deleted the sequences. That is highly irregular. Researchers don't usually like to do that. 2nd, they commanded that the command and control of the lab from civilian control to military control, which is highly unusual as well. And the 3rd thing they did, which I think is really telling, is that they left a contractor redo the ventilation system in that specific laboratory. There's strong evidence there was a significant event in that laboratory in September 2019. So, after this, we know that the media downplayed the entire COVID-19 coming from a lab theory. That has been an often debate in America, but as you can tell now, it's pretty obvious that's exactly what happened, is that it started in Wuhan and it was fully funded by the United States government and the NIHS. So we had our pie in it. But what does China say about all this? Once dismissed as a fringe conspiracy theory resurfaced by FBI Director Christopher Wray's comments, the Bureau believes COVID-19 most likely originated in a Chinese government-controlled lab. Now, this is where it gets interesting. We already went over about how a lot of people America has already been convinced that we funded all of this. Now, the wording of the FBI here is very careful. They say Chinese government controlled lab. Now, before all of this happened, our relationship with China was just good enough that we could fund things in China, and China could fund things in our land for the most part, if you win over enough red tape. Nowadays, a bit harder to do that, and this is why. They're saying Chinese government controlled lab, which it's within Chinese land, so China does have, you could say control over said lab. But that's a pretty vague way of saying it if the person paying the bills is us. So is the person paying the bills the person who controls the lab, or is the person that owns the building the person who controls the lab? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, which one's real? In response to this, Beijing accused Washington of political manipulation. Kinda. China has hit back at suggestions the virus may have escaped from a laboratory by calling it a smear. State media has consistently accused the U.S. government and Western media of spreading rumors about the source of the pandemic. Responding to Mr. Ray's remarks, China's foreign ministry spokesperson accused U.S. intelligence agency of politicizing the investigation into the origins of the virus. I kind of agree with that. The U.S. intelligence community has a history of misdeeds involving fraud and deception, Mao Ning told a press briefing. As such, she said their conclusions regarding the origins of COVID-19 had no credibility. Well, you can't just say everything we said is wrong. Some of us are speaking some truth. China has pushed another theory suggesting the COVID may have entered Wuhan in food shipments of frozen meat from elsewhere in China or Southeast Asia. The Chinese government has also pointed to research published by one of its leading virologists into samples collected from bats in a remote abandoned mine. Now here is where we have the real interesting theory, okay? So, China's saying, screw you, America. None of that makes sense. We're not going to accept any of that. Because if they did accept that, then they'd be accepting blame that they did technically were aware of the lab existing and that they technically had control over it, which they wouldn't want to do. So they kind of suggested frozen meat from elsewhere in China, which I still think somewhat puts the blame on China. But they are now also saying that they've collected samples from bats in abandoned mines. Professor Shi Zhengli, often referred to as China's Batwoman, a researcher at the Wuhan Institute, published a report in 2021 revealing that her team had identified 8 coronavirus stains found on bats in the mine in China in 2015. The paper says that coronaviruses from pangolins pose more of an immediate threat to human health than the ones her team found in the mine. Okay, so on one side we have the United States blaming China for this. Well, we have two sides of the United States, actually. Can I make a Venn diagram? All right, so far this is what we've gathered. There is the USA and China on top of our Venn diagram. The USA believes in natural spread via Dr. Fauci. China hasn't necessarily disagreed with that because we could all argue it was just a natural spread and who the hell knows anyways. But we do somewhat agree that it maybe originated from a lab in Wuhan. If not, maybe that specifically, China says maybe frozen food in China. Anyways, it all comes back to the cave bats. Now, with the cave bats, this is where it gets interesting. Did the Americans or did the Chinese infect these cave bats? Now, how does one put a virus in a bunch of cave bats? I would like to bring you Evidence A. Based on previous studies about the distributions of penis length and circumference, the average American erect penis length was estimated as 6 inches and circumference as 5 inches. Meanwhile, if we compare ourselves to the Chinese men measure 5.5 inches. I had to go to Reddit to find circumference of a Chinese penis, but it's 10.5 centimeters, which is about 4.1 inches in circumference. After this overwhelming evidence, we can all come together and agree that the Americans had absolutely no fault. Look, our penises are just far too large. We cannot have done anything with those bats. It would have murdered the bat. And then how could it spread the disease then? You see, this, my honor, fits. This is like that video of that monkey using a frog as a fleshlight. This is totally plausible. The American one, on the other hand, look at this sledgehammer, the absolute mastodon. This is no longer a frog and a monkey. This is a monkey and a rhinoceros. There is absolutely no way in hell this bat is walking away from this endeavor. This is an absolute atrocity to all humankind, and quite frankly, China needs to apologize.